Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. My name is Akudo Anyanwu. I'm the Vice President for Development at Texas Biomed. And I'm pleased this morning to have the opportunity to introduce our guest for this session, which is a very special case study in resource mobilization. So we get to listen in on a really important conversation and learn from two partners who worked together to raise millions of dollars for COVID and to really push out therapeutics and support for vaccines. And so my first guest is Shamina Singh. Shamina Singh, for more than 20 years, has been on the front lines of developing and implementing solutions to make the global economy work for everyone and everywhere. Shamina is the founder and president of the Center for Inclusive Growth, the philanthropic hub of Mastercard. She also serves as executive vice president of corporate sustainability. In both these capacities, Shamina is charged with activating the philanthropic dollars of the Mastercard Impact Fund, a $500 million pool of capital committed to advancing inclusive growth around the world. Welcome, Shamina. I should also say that Shamina is a good friend of mine who I've known for years, and it's really a pleasure to have you. I know what a dynamite she can be in the space of global health and really improving economies around the world. So she's someone who I'm very proud to call my friend, and thanks for answering the call to be on this session today. Next, I'll introduce Brad Wilken. Brad Wilken is the Deputy Director of Product Development Operations on the Strategy, Planning, and Management team in Global Health at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In this role, Brad is responsible for supporting internal teams and external partners to optimize the Foundation's approach to consistently delivering high-impact interventions using industry best practices. Brad has been with the Foundation since 2016 and has played key roles in establishing the Gates Medical Research Institute and the innovation introduction function within global health. Currently, Brad is leading the COVID-19 therapeutics work at the Foundation via COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator. It's great to have you here, Brad, and thanks for joining us. As I mentioned, folks, we have two distinguished panelists. We have an opportunity to gain some insight as these two friends and colleagues have a conversation and really share with us what it took to establish the funds that they did to fight COVID-19. So I will stop there and hand over to you, Shamina. Shamina will moderate this conversation and we get to listen in. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Akudo. Really excited to be here. And, you know, this is the first time I think that Brad and I have been in a public session together where we're going to take a little trip down memory lane, although it's not a very far trip, but it's an important trip, about what our partnership looked like and what life was like just a mere few months ago. And so you all who are participating now are, I guess, really our first audience of sort of a behind the scenes look at a partnership and indeed a friendship that developed very quickly for a very important purpose. So with that, Brad, let me just, if I can, take you down memory lane. I've seen you in that chair for the past many months. And so, but let me just remind you of sort of what the timeline was, right? So let's see here. Ajay, okay, so some of the characters in the story, right? So Shamina Singh on the philanthropy side for Mastercard, Brad Wilken on the scientific side for Gates, trying to understand what's happening in COVID. But then you have Bill Gates and you have Ajay Banga. Ajay Banga is the executive chairman now of Mastercard, but at the time he was the CEO. And of course, Bill Gates leading the Gates Foundation and the work there. So this was, if I remember correctly, Friday, March 6th, Bill reached out to Ajay and said, we are starting an accelerator to develop a therapeutic response to COVID. Now, this was March 6th of 2020. And so this was before anything had even been declared. So let me just remind everybody, March, the WHO declared COVID-19 outbreak, I'm just looking at my notes here, a global pandemic on March 11th. So this is before WHO even declared this a pandemic. So this was a call that happened on a Friday. And tell me, but before we get there, what was going on at the Gates Foundation? Talk a little bit about the history of where you all were, and then tell us what it took for you to get to Bill, for Bill to get to Ajay, and then we'll pick up the conversation about what happened after that call.
Yeah, no, this is great, and it's fun to think about that time period, but also a little anxiety inducing. But yeah, so in mid to late January, we started to see a lot of information coming, out of China, et cetera. So a small group of us actually had just a whiteboard session, all day session, in Trevor Mundell, he's the president of global health at the foundation, in his office. And we also had folks like Jeremy Farrar and others on the phone from Wilken Trust. And we were kind of whiteboarding out some ideas just from shared learnings from the Ebola days on what would we need to do to quickly get a therapeutic available. So we just had a simple schematic of kind of the steps that needed to happen. And then ultimately, how could we just parallel process that stuff? So how could we start making stuff before we knew it worked, that type of thinking. And then we took that idea, actually there's somewhat of an infamous dinner on Valentine's Day that Bill and Melinda hosted at their residence for a lot of senior leadership at the foundation. We talked about what the data was showing, where would we be at vaccines, and this idea of a therapeutic accelerator came up, some sort of a clearinghouse or organizing mechanism in the therapeutic space, because we were rather confident it was going to get addressed on the vaccine side. You have Gavis and institutions like that help coordinate and aggregate, but on the therapeutic side, there really wasn't an entity like that existed. So we knew something like that needed to get set up. And we also got creative, I think, in talking about, okay, well, how are we going to fund this thing? Welcome was very excited to come on board. Obviously, we were very engaged. So our philanthropic team got creative and thought, well, why don't we do a more, we'll talk to our traditional partners in the philanthropic space, but let's open it up a little bit. Bill, let's get you and Melinda on the phone. Let's start utilizing your networks, et cetera. Let's see what kind of resources we can mobilize and get folks energetic. So you're right. So that happened through February to start, getting things off. And then you guys came on board so fast before, as you mentioned, before the pandemic was even officially declared. And with that launch, subsequent funders came on board, like Chan Zuckerberg, Dell Foundation, and others very quickly thereafter.
So I'll pick up the story from there. So I guess you guys got it up to, so that Friday. So
right.
From what I know from Ajay, Bill called him on, I think it was a Friday, maybe morning, afternoon, I don't know. But he and said, look, we're building this therapeutics accelerator. We think something's going to be happening with this COVID thing. We don't think it's some small thing that's going to be isolated. Yep. We actually think this is going to have global ramifications, and we need to quickly move to ramp up our response. And Ajay, because Mastercard sort of has a history of moving very quickly, and two, has an understanding of the connection globally, and has spent a lot of time working on financial security and things like that. We're reaching out to a few private sector CEO and companies that we know sort of kind of get it and can get it quickly and understand how these things work. So I'm not exactly sure who else he called, but I know he called Ajay on a Friday. That Friday, I think Ajay assembled the leadership team at Mastercard, so probably 15 minutes later, got us all on a call and said, look, here's what's happening. Here's, I kind of think that this thing is going to become bigger than what we're seeing right now. I think as a company, we need to move quickly because what we know will happen is that, that sort of developed economies will always have access or will get first access to vaccine or treatment or whatever he said I just, he said, having worked on this financial inclusion stuff for so long, I know that, developed markets will sort of have the infrastructure in place and do what they need to do. He said, our focus really needs to be on ensuring equity and ensuring that there's equitable distribution of whatever comes down the pike. He said, I don't know what that's going to be. It could be vaccines, could be these therapeutics, as Bill Gates is telling me. There's going to be a need for testing, all of those things. We have no idea. And he said, but I know that there's going to be an equity issue that's involved. So I think that Mastercard should consider joining this coalition quickly and early, so that we set a tone and a pace for other private sector companies who may not be as comfortable in the space. He said, we don't know about vaccines. We don't know about malaria. We don't know. I mean, that's not Mastercard's thing, but we do know that this thing is going to be big. And so I will tell you that on that Friday, we had that call. Obviously, as a company and a foundation that we had to do a bunch of due diligence. We had a bunch of people. We had to, talk to other companies. There was so much that we had to do, to respond accordingly. And I think it was by Tuesday we were announcing our partnership. So this call happened on a Friday. We had decided and done the clearances and done the approvals by Monday. And I think Tuesday, it was Gates, the Welcome Trust, and Mastercard. We announced our $25 million commitment. You guys put in $50 million apiece. And so we were announcing a $125 million fund on the Tuesday. And if I remember correctly, the pandemic was declared, again, let me just make sure, on March 11th. So we announced on March 10th. The pandemic was declared on March 11th. So the day before the WHO announced a pandemic, we had created the accelerator. So it's, I think it's a little anxiety inducing, but that was sort of, I think, how we got involved. But then, Brad, pick up the story from, so then can you explain kind of the process that you all went through to build out? If I recall correctly, you said we need to use machine learning to test every single potential combination of drugs to see if any of these will have a therapeutics. And also, this was before, I think, China even released the sequencing of the thing.
Well,
So
it was closely thereafter, but just closely thereafter. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the 125, and then ultimately, the CTA effort has gotten close to 340 million. So, I mean, if you were even just a small biotech startup, that's quite successful in the private world. So, but yeah, from there, I would categorize it as, excuse me, we knew there would be three big buckets of work that we would need to help coordinate and prioritize. Our target product profile for the therapeutics, just to give a little bit of context, was to develop a treatment that could keep people out of the hospital. Because we knew a lot of low resource settings, obviously, from primary care to oxygen, et cetera, those are going to be a really confined resource. So what could we do to identify and help those that were at high risk of progressing? So can we focus on the outpatient setting? There was a lot of money and a lot of action going to severe disease, but the big gap that we could help fill for low resource settings is in that outpatient use case. So what we had talked about is, okay, the quick wins would be what's already approved and available. Does any of that stuff, is that going to work? And there was a lot of press early on about hydroxychloroquine and a lot of other things going on out there right there. So we spent some resources early on, which ultimately confirmed no, this repurposing effort of existing drugs, there wasn't really a strong signal there. So then secondarily, we moved further upstream in the R&D process and looked at, okay, what's maybe in the clinic right now? It's not officially approved, but is there something in clinical trials right now that we could potentially repurpose and use as well? And then lastly, if both of those efforts fail, let's look even more upstream in de novo in the lab and see if what we can do to help expedite something being created from scratch. Obviously, the further up you go, the longer it's going to take and more difficult it is. We certainly took some, moonshot bets on some of those later stage assets, but ultimately that's how it was. I would say in the it was in the R&D space, and then also in the manufacturing side, we knew manufacturing was going to be pretty rate limiting, so we investigated what could we do to bring that earlier. Traditionally, pharma does this very risk averse, very staged and sequential. I need answer A before I'll invest in this, and et cetera, et cetera. So we thought about, well, if the CTA's funding, could we de-risk for a private partner and say, you know what, we'll take on the risk and let's move the manufacturing up much earlier when we're still not quite sure of the signal. So those were kind of some big strategic things we're thinking about.
It's interesting, and even hearing you talk, I remember we were having conversation. Again, this was a group of people who weren't very well versed at all in the health field, and you were trying, and I admire so much that we were meeting. I think we were talking to each other almost daily at some point, and then we got into a cadence of once a week or something like that. Mm-hmm. You had this, and I'd love to hear just how you sort of balance this, right? So you had this group of scientists and very technical conversations that were happening around what is this going to take? And then you had a group of, people like us who were sort of like, help us understand how we explain this to our stakeholders, right? Because on our side, I think Mastercard employees, our folks were very excited that, they were kind of scratching their heads. They were like, wait, this is going to become a bigger deal. Mastercard's getting involved. This is like $25 million. Hold on. This is a lot of money. So we had this whole conversation happening with our employees, with our leadership, with, customers and things like that to say, hey, the reason why we've done this is, and the reason why you should all be paying attention is this thing is going to get really big. And so we were sort of trying to pull from you all the topics or the sort of the issues, and then trying to translate those out into our communities. And there was actually a letter, I think, that went from Ajay and Bill, right? If you remember this, there was a letter that Ajay and Bill wrote sort of explaining the partnership, but explaining why the partnership was important between a private sector company like Mastercard and a foundation like Gates, that actually went to, I think, all of the members of the World Economic Forum. So all of the corporate members of the World Economic Forum, that so that they could understand why it was important for private sector to get really involved in the conversation. But then we used that letter as the basis for how we started communicating with our stakeholders so that they could understand the reason why a company like us would get involved in the conversation. Mm-hmm. How did you, again, and this may have just become part of the moment, but did you go through a process of saying, okay, we really need to figure out how we translate these very complex terms and concepts to an audience that, is freaking out, because of the pandemic, but also needs to understand what's happening? How did you balance that conversation?
Yeah, it was tricky. Early on, to be honest, so I come from the R&D side. I'm not a scientist, but I help herd the cats and try to coordinate things as best I can. I hadn't really touched personally the philanthropic side. So I sort of was playing this role of, being the mediator between what was going on scientifically with yourself and a lot of other partners that ultimately became interested. So we were doing that on a really ad hoc basis, where Bill would receive a phone call from CEO X, Brad, get on the phone and explain what we're doing. So we were doing that really ad hoc. But then once that note came out, we officially launched with you guys and Welcome Trust. The note went to the Economic Forum. That's when we started putting the more governance structure, I think, that you were alluding to on a weekly basis. So we tried to balance that we needed to allow the scientists to have those really detailed in the weeds discussions and not put too much infrastructure in the way of just getting money out the door and getting these experiments going. So we tried to firewall that off to the side. But then also we had that weekly meeting with the founding funders to, okay, guys, let's make sure we're watching some of the big money items, that we're all clear on where that's going, why, and if we're making any strategic pivots. And I think it was great, to be honest with you, that we had a lot of folks that were somewhat new to the global health space, because I think it forced some of the scientists, when they get in a little bit of those modes of thinking, to kind of pause and articulate it from a 10,000 foot view. If that's tough to do, maybe there's a gap. So I think that was a good exercise to be, spend some time doing Global Health 101 in some of those meetings that we had to do to get a lot of the funders comfortable on the how, why, and when we were doing a lot of the investments. So it was a learning process there at first. I think we got by the early summer, we got in a pretty good cadence on what needed to go to what venue. And I think everybody started to get pretty comfortable and understand what was going on.
Yeah, I agree. I remember a conversation, and I don't remember when it was, but you were trying to explain monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
We're explaining, but the other thing that you all were explaining was that we needed to be prepared for the supply chain issue.
Right.
We see it so clearly now, but almost a year ago, you all were saying, look, in order to even move a vaccine or a therapeutic, you need to commission a certain type of glass from one place for the tubes, a certain type of stopper from another part of the global supply chain. You have to be able to get this on a plane. You were sort of, and it was, for me, and for my colleagues, we were just blown away because, of course, we hadn't thought about all of these things, but to sort of be thinking about them in the moment while we were also hearing the news reports, and we're seeing, Dr. Fauci, and we're seeing all of these, like trying to, really sift through the information to understand what was real in some respects, but also what was worth, passing on. Can I ask a question about how you all, because I remember some conversations when something would come up at the news and you almost use us as a platform to say, look, here's what you may be hearing. Here's what's actually happening. How did you balance that? And how did you start to see us as a sort of as an ambassador, or as a place to start getting more information out? Or what was your thinking around that?
I think both. I mean, the ambassador and also helping be a champion, because I think we started to coalesce around just, the trust and the group. It wasn't just at the end of the day, a lot of individual funders. I think it really started to come together as a coherent group to help advocate what the right messaging is out there. I mean, I think in good and bad ways, the vaccine stuff, was priority 1A for a lot of people, funders, developers, etc. And we somewhat were even in a more uphill challenge when a lot of the early vaccine data came out that, this is 90% effective, problem solved, we're good to go. But, we had been advocating since we officially launched this back in March that there still is going to be a need for treatments. Either some of these vaccines aren't going to be available in low resource settings, the timeline, we could be a few years out. There still is a lot of development challenges for the vaccines, and some people might not be able to take them. So there still would be a need for therapeutics. So it was helpful to have that group there to help broadcast that message. I feel like that was somewhat falling through the cracks on the need for a therapeutic, and still today, to be honest with you. I think it's highlighted the dire need for something in our toolkit other than just a vaccine. I think it was amazing to have, and you guys weren't completely new to global health either, right? I mean, you challenged us kind of thinking about data, and are there more systemic platform type things we need to think about more long term. So there was a lot of good challenging conversations that the group brought.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting point, because it was a little bit of the partnership of assets too, right?
Yeah.
So we're bringing the science of this. I think the thing that I learned was that, Mastercard as a company that's in the network and the data and the validation business in some regards, because you have to know who the network allows you to sort of validate payment, right? And so we were asking questions about, can we be using, the research we've been doing around things like identity and things around, are you who you say you are? Are you, and because we move money around the world to the places that are supposed to get it, we were also thinking about how we might use our assets as a global payments company in the technology space to think about, are there things we could do to make sure that the vaccines or the therapeutics are real? Like, are there issues around provenance? Are there issues around identity in terms of, how are these things moving and who's getting them and things like that? So I think for us, the interesting conversations around, are there ways that we could be helpful in the distribution of the therapeutic and the distribution of testing and the distribution of vaccine to ensure that the right things were happening in the right way. So for me, it was also, and I think for the company, it was a way to really see the assets of a payments company in the technology space get applied to an entirely different setting in the healthcare space. So I thought that was, for us, I thought that was also a very interesting thing that we have continued to do because, of course, this hasn't gone away. And indeed, we're seeing it continue in around the world. And so I guess before we move to the Q&A, two quick things. One,
Sure.
Can you talk about equity and, what's happening now and how do we continue to focus on this idea of equitable access? And then two, were there some bets that didn't work and something that you would have done differently? And then we will open it up for Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. I think on the equitable access, depending on the modality, there's certainly some nuances. But I mean, overall, what we can do to have a solution available at the same time that high-income countries get it, as well as at a cost that makes sense. So it's all about time and cost at the end of the day. And that's why we were really trying to influence a lot of our resources. If there were products being developed, we would only back those or help de-risk those that could ultimately meet that target product, that target profile. If there were cost barriers or timeline barriers, those are off the table. Those are no-go. So I think that really helped with a lot of the no-go criteria earlier on. We got a long way to go, though. There's still obviously not equitable access yet in a lot of respects. But I think this experience has certainly highlighted they're still there, but maybe some solutions, what we can do about it this time. So I'm optimistic that we can address that. I think some of the bets that in retrospect we didn't work. So we did invest some money in the hydroxychloroquine stuff earlier on. It was primarily to show we didn't think it was work, but we needed a confirmatory study to confirm this will not work because it was pulling supply from other diseases and other supply chains that we were really worried about. So that was an initial investment that ultimately confirmed a no. Some of the other earlier bets, one of the biggest risk bet we made because everybody was, you mentioned the supply chain piece. There were a lot of organizations and governments going out and reserving manufacturing capacity or supply chain stuff at risk in advance. Nobody was doing that on behalf of low to middle income countries. So on behalf of the CTA, we reserved a huge chunk of monoclonal antibody capacity before we even knew which construct was going to go in there way in advance, just to make sure there was a seat at the table for low resource settings for this asset. Because scientifically, we were anticipating that may have been the first, and it was and still is really the only solution that works in the outpatient setting. Yeah, so that kind of gives a few examples, and yeah, I'd love to hear some more in the Q&A, and if you could even share any more thoughts on kind of more background of what you think worked well from from a funder perspective coming in, and what were some of the lessons learned from your perspective.
Yeah, we'll turn it over to Akudo to lead the Q&A, but I think from our side, the internal conversation was really, if we're going to do this, we have to have a trusted partner. So
Yep.
this was not something we would have done or even considered doing if it hadn't been, for you all having this very clear history of doing this work. So I think the credibility of the partnership was enormously important for us. And I think that if we sort of had to do it all over again, my sense is that we would have organized our resources in a way to respond even faster with the technology side of this. So I think we led with the funding because, of course, that's what you all needed and what was required. But I do think that on the technology side, we would have probably jumped in even more and said, we pull together a rapid response team inside the company to say, how do we pivot our technology in such a way to advance the work of the accelerator and the vaccine program? So those are probably two things, but and we'll have a quick sign off before the end. But Akudo, over to you to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Well, thank you so very much, Shamina and Brad, for all that you've shared. I, listening in, have learned so much, and I know that all our viewers are just amazed that they get to have an insight into such a unique conversation and set of events that transpired right before the COVID pandemic was called a pandemic and right afterwards. So first of all, congratulations to you, Shamina and Brad, for all that work and getting it off the ground so quickly. And Shamina, for moving Mastercard to make this investment before it was popular, before anyone knew that this was going to be as big as it turned out. So, and so in light of that, my first question is to you, Shamina. What does it take to get a corporate entity such as the one that you work for to make such a bold move and a bold statement? What was it about Mastercard, your leadership, the leadership of the CEO, that made this possible?
Well, Akudo, I think look, I could go on for hours and hours about the leadership of Ajay Banga as an individual, but I also think that the company, people don't know this, but the largest shareholder of Mastercard is the Mastercard Foundation. So when the company went public, it created the Mastercard Foundation from stock. So there is an investment in doing well by doing good that is built into the DNA of the company. And so I think that's thing one, is that from the outset, there is that piece of the puzzle. The second thing is we've had a commitment to financial inclusion for so long. So there is a clear understanding at the company around the need to have equitable access to financial resources and the focus on financial security. So from a cultural perspective and from an intellectual perspective, we weren't that far off. So the speed of the decision, I think, can be attributed to the executives at the company who really did get in a room very quickly and sort of hammer out the conceptual notion that allowed the people on the social impact side and the philanthropic side to dig in on the substance and see what could be done quickly.
That's very insightful. I mean, it sounds like you all already had a culture in place. You had that DNA of, valuing equity, inclusion already. I mean, you're leading the Center for Inclusive Growth. So it says a lot, I think, about where you guys already were as an institution, and I really commend the efforts that you've made. Brad, I have a question for you. I want to know which donor surprised you most. And in that context, I've heard that there's a Madonna story. So please tell us.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, all the donors surprised me because it was somewhat of a new space for me to get involved. And we had people from $50 up to 50 million. So there were, we had a group that was sort of triaging a lot of the contributions, and they would reach out to me periodically. Hey, can you join this call, help them understand, what we're doing. And then Madonna ultimately was one of those on that list. She contributed $1 million. So in the typical gracious fashion, Bill or Melinda would join a lot of the calls initially and say, thank you. Hey, this is what we're going to do. Ask any questions, be appreciative. And I still have a selfie of myself when during the meeting invite, because I had to help set it up and broker the call, it was, Bill Gates to call Brad Wilken to phone in Madonna. I just, for me, it couldn't get any better than that. So I took that was definitely the highlight in a fun way.
Wow, that must have been a memorable moment. I do have a couple more questions here. I want to know, and this is for you, Shamina, as companies are looking to build forward better, right? You guys were ready, you already had the culture in place, but there are many that are really taking, looking at themselves with a critical eye and trying to do things differently in this new world that we've come into. What's your advice for them post-COVID? What do they need to do? Where do they start to build forward for a new world?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because I really do think that COVID has really shined a light on the importance of public sector, private sector, social sector fulfilling their potential, but also fulfilling their responsibility. And so I think you're right to say that there are a lot of private sector entities who are trying to understand what that means for them. And so the one thing I'd say is to just have a look at your assets, right? Like we talked about funding as the very clear, first primary thing, but companies have a lot, they have the work that they do as companies, the reasons why they exist. And so I do think understanding your assets as a firm. So whether it's technology, whether it is data, if it's supply chain management, whatever your industry is, getting a good sense of what it is, understanding what it is you do can be turned to a lens of social impact or environmental impact. That's the process that we've undertaken at Mastercard, was to say, Mastercard is a technology company, it's a data company, it's an analytics company, it has great employees. How do we turn all of those assets to ensure that they're expanded to include social impact as much as they are profitability? So it really is looking at your assets across the board to see how you make sure you can turn them to social impact. And then the second thing I'd say is, and that's a process, that is a journey to be sure. But I think that the other piece of this is to reach out to companies who are on this journey and to create community around those. And so certainly we at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth would be happy to be a resource. But I think through things like the accelerator, we've also found like minds and would be happy to join in partnership and coalition to expand things like the CTA to say, who were members of that? Can we form something else now to do something else and invite others to be a part of it?
That's really wonderful, Shamina. And actually, it builds on a comment that was just sent in by our CEO of Texas Biomed. He says, I'm enjoying the conversation about how you learn to work with each other from different sectors in response to the pandemic. What is your vision for the future? Shouldn't there be an ongoing consortium working together on major infectious disease challenges so pivoting can occur more quickly? Is there a role for a nonprofit like Texas Biomed as part of a group leaning in? So this, I would love to hear from you, Brad, your thoughts on that. And maybe Shamina, you have something to add, but I like this question, this comment, because Shamina, I think this points to just what you were saying, that you're happy to sort of help mentor others and lean into a coalition. And then I saw this question from Dr. Schlesinger come in, so it's timely. Brad, any thoughts? And Shamina, I'd love for you to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, short answer is yes, absolutely. I still think there's a role, certainly for public and governments to step in, but on the private philanthropic, I mean, this unique area that we created with the CTA, I mean, ultimately was a way to try to help coordinate what was going on out there. And frankly, it's still not yet quite coordinated where we need to be as a global health ecosystem in terms of preparing for the next pandemic. I mean, I saw an article the other day that Janet Woodcock, the current acting FDA administrator, they're guesstimating about 5 to 6% of active clinical trials right now are not going to, those only 5 to 6% would be ultimately actionable or of a certain standard quality. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there that might not be the best use of our resources. So yes, I think there is absolutely a need today, and there's going to be a need to have some sort of coordinating, aggregating mechanism, not only to aggregate funding, but just coordinate the assets. As even Shamina was saying earlier, what's the pipeline of our tools and who's doing what? Just really basic coordinating our solutions out there.
Thank you so much, Brad. Would you like to weigh in on that, Shamina?
No, I mean, I think Brad has. I mean, the only piece that I'd add here is, the idea of entities and institutions, I think, is really important. But, in the end, it's also about human relationship. And so I think the other piece about the COVID crisis has also brought out our humanity in a way that is required. Like, you cannot sit as a private sector entity, as a public sector entity, you can't sit in your sectors. You have to show up as who you are, as humans and individuals. And then that is the thing that breaks down the silos. And so the huge time commitment that goes into the laws and the regulations and the processes and the protocols that are required to work across sectors is really there because there's an inherent lack of trust between those sectors. And that inherent lack of trust, I think, is because there's an inherent lack of friendship and relationship across those organizations. And so I think the faster we can move out of these silos of your public sector, so you think this way, your private sector, so you think this way, you're this person, so you think this way, and get into a place of, hey, we have a collective vision to, provide sustainable and equitable, for us, economic growth to everyone everywhere. So how do you sort of move beyond the titles and the sectors and the stuff that's outside to really making sure that we, at the end of the day, connect as human beings?
Thank you so much. That is, I think that's been a common thread through a lot of the conversations during this symposium. The idea of trust, the idea of listening and getting insights from communities. This has been coming up. It came up yesterday with Barbara Pierce Bush's session as well. She talked about trust, talked about engaging young people. And I think you guys are really bringing it home. It sounds like what was at the core, and it's come up a number of times in this conversation, what was at the core of being able to build this fund essentially overnight was trust. So it's trust between leaders, trust between organizations, and as you said, Shamina, getting behind a collective vision, which was something that brought you all together. I know our time is fast spent. We have 2 more minutes. I do want to give each of you 1 minute each to tell the audience what you want them to know. What is the most important point you want to sort of leave them with as we wrap up this conversation? If there's one important point you'd like to make, this is your opportunity. And I'll start with you, Brad, and then we'll end with Shamina.
I would say leaving with some optimism that, we've identified a lot of the gaps that are needed in global health, as well as we've been able to fix a lot of those. At the same time, there's still a long ways to go. So I hope that we don't lose some of the momentum that this pandemic has created, and then we're in the same situation or in a reactive mode for COVID 2025 or whatever that future pandemic is. So I really hope we continue to keep the relationship strong, as Shamina highlighted. Let's keep the momentum going and not lose this, because this is something I think we really need to make sure is sustainable.
Great.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you, Brad. Shamina?
Yeah, I would agree with Brad, and I'd also be remiss, I think, if both of us really didn't thank the teams that have really been leading the effort from both of our sides. Like Brad at the Gates Foundation, the team, Jen, and all the people over there. Like, I can't minimize how important it was that everybody was in the spirit of, it was optimism isn't the right word, but it was sort of like being sober and being serious and being decent and always keeping those things at the forefront of the conversation. I guess that would be the thing that I'd love to, leave the audience with, is that if we can be an example, Brad Wilken and Shamina Singh would have never met in another planet, like in another lifetime, right? Akudo and Shamina may not have met in another lifetime. But the point is that we took, you know, we can be examples of how this stuff has to work, and it can work. And speed and diligence and you know, information and execution are not mutually exclusive. We do not have to wait years and years and years and years to move on things if the priority is the one that we all believe in. So I just want to thank you, Akudo, for giving us an opportunity to come together and share our story and relive it in some weird way. And of course, Brad, thank you for your partnership and your friendship, and much more to come.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you all have been amazing. Thanks for sharing your story with us. Thank you for being a part of the 80th anniversary of Texas Biomed and this Global Health Symposium. We look forward to continuing these discussions with you, but we have heard you. I think we have heard the common themes of trust, relationship, moving quickly, starting from the position of your values and ensuring that those values are in place, because that's what gives you, I think, that speed and agility to move when there's a crisis. So thanks for all you've shared, and we will be in touch, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you
so much.